The autumn fog clung to the industrial district of Blackhaven like a shroud, thick and impenetrable, muffling the usual cacophony of machinery and labor. It was within this murky veil that the first accident occurred at the Thornbridge manufacturing plant, a sprawling complex of brick and iron that had stood for nearly a century. A hydraulic press, typically as reliable as the sunrise, had malfunctioned during the night shift, crushing a maintenance worker's hand with such precision that surgeons could do little but amputate. The official report blamed worn gaskets and operator error, a conclusion that satisfied the factory owners, the insurance adjusters, and the local constabulary. Elias Crowe read the incident report 3 times, his pale fingers tracing the typed lines as if searching for invisible ink. He sat in his cluttered study, surrounded by stacks of newspapers, chemical apparatus, and curiosities collected from a dozen closed cases. The room smelled of tobacco, old paper, and something vaguely caustic from an experiment he'd abandoned weeks ago. Sleep had eluded him for 72 hours, not from any particular distress, but from the simple fact that his mind refused to quiet itself. Boredom had become his constant companion, a gnawing presence that made even the most mundane news article worth scrutinizing. The accident itself wasn't remarkable. Industrial mishaps occurred with depressing regularity in cities like Blackhaven, where profit margins often trumped safety protocols. What caught Crowe's attention was a single detail buried in the appendix of the report. The maintenance logs showed the hydraulic system had been serviced just 48 hours before the incident. Fresh gaskets, new fluid, a clean bill of health from a certified technician. Yet somehow, catastrophic failure. Crowe's mind began constructing models, hypotheticals branching like neurons firing in rapid succession. Sabotage was the obvious conclusion, but sabotage required motive, and the victim was a low-level maintenance worker with no known enemies, no debts, no controversies. Unless the target wasn't the individual, but the disruption itself. Unless someone was testing variables. Unless this was the opening move in a larger game. He reached for his phone to dismiss the thought, to return to the comfortable fog of ennui, when a message arrived from Clara Finch. She'd been investigating labor conditions at Blackhaven's factories for her column and had heard whispers of the accident. Her text was characteristically direct. "Something feels wrong about this. Worth looking into." Crowe stared at the message, his jaw tightening. Clara had an unfortunate talent for identifying cases that would consume him entirely, pulling him from the comfortable numbness of isolation into the exhausting world of human suffering and moral complexity. 3 weeks passed before the second incident, and it was Clara who brought it to Crowe's attention. She arrived at his study unannounced, as was her habit, carrying a leather satchel filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten interviews. The second accident had occurred at the Meridian Textile Mill, 6 miles from the Thornbridge plant. A steam boiler had overpressurized during the early morning shift, exploding with enough force to tear through the eastern wall of the facility. 2 workers suffered severe burns, and a third lost hearing in one ear from the concussive blast. Crowe listened to Clara's recitation of facts with his eyes closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. She described the official investigation's findings: a faulty pressure relief valve, inadequate monitoring, and systemic negligence by management. The mill's owners were facing heavy fines and potential criminal charges for safety violations. It was, by all accounts, a tragic but explicable industrial accident in a facility with a documented history of cutting corners. But Clara had done what investigators rarely bothered to do. She'd examined the maintenance records herself, charming her way into the administrative offices with the promise of sympathetic coverage. The pressure relief valve had been replaced 3 weeks prior as part of a routine upgrade. The monitoring systems had been inspected and certified just days before the explosion. The boiler itself was less than 5 years old, well within its operational lifespan. Crowe's eyes opened, suddenly alert. The temporal spacing between incidents, 3 weeks, was too deliberate to ignore. He crossed to his wall of maps, where Blackhaven's industrial district sprawled across yellowing paper marked with pins and annotations from previous cases. He added 2 new pins, one for Thornbridge, one for Meridian. The distance between them formed no obvious pattern, but patterns often revealed themselves only with sufficient data points. He began his investigation in earnest that evening, visiting both facilities under the pretense of writing a technical paper on industrial safety protocols. His credentials as a consulting expert in forensic analysis opened doors that would have remained closed to police investigators. At Thornbridge, he examined the hydraulic press, noting the precise point of failure in the gasket housing. The damage was consistent with deliberate scoring of the metal surface, subtle enough to escape casual inspection, but sufficient to ensure failure under pressure. At Meridian, the pressure relief valve showed similar signs of tampering, microscopic adjustments to the spring tension that would cause it to fail at a predictable threshold. The saboteur possessed mechanical expertise and access to both facilities. More intriguingly, they had executed their alterations with surgical precision, ensuring maximum disruption while minimizing the possibility of fatal casualties. The attacks were designed to injure, to disrupt, to terrify, but not to kill. This restraint suggested either conscience or calculation, and Crowe suspected the latter. Someone was conducting experiments, testing the responsiveness of emergency services, the thoroughness of investigations, the resilience of industrial infrastructure. As he compiled his findings in the early hours of morning, surrounded by photographs and technical diagrams, a familiar sensation crept through his consciousness, the intellectual signature of his oldest adversary. Damien Vale had been quiet for nearly 8 months, his last scheme, a brilliant manipulation of stock markets through targeted misinformation, having ended with Vale escaping prosecution through sheer cleverness and lack of physical evidence. Vale's schemes always possessed a quality of academic curiosity, as if he were less interested in profit than in proving some abstract thesis about human behavior or systemic vulnerability. Crowe stood at his window, watching dawn break over Blackhaven's rooftops, and allowed himself a rare smile. Boredom had fled, replaced by the electric anticipation of intellectual combat. Understanding Damien Vale required understanding the philosophy that animated his crimes. Unlike common criminals motivated by greed, passion, or desperation, Vale operated from a position of pure intellectual curiosity. He possessed a fortune inherited from pharmaceutical patents, a mind that rivaled Crowe's own, and an ideology that viewed society as a vast experiment waiting for the right variables to be manipulated. Where Crowe sought patterns to restore order, Vale created patterns to demonstrate the fragility of that order. Their rivalry had begun 5 years earlier when Crowe had dismantled Vale's first major scheme, a series of orchestrated art thefts designed not for profit but to expose security vulnerabilities in museums across Europe. Vale had been impressed rather than angered by his defeat, sending Crowe a handwritten letter complimenting his deductive methodology while politely disagreeing with his conclusions about human nature. Since then, their encounters had followed a predictable rhythm. Vale would engineer some elaborate disruption, Crowe would unravel it, and Vale would escape with enough grace to suggest he'd anticipated his own failure as part of the experiment. But the factory incidents suggested an evolution in Vale's approach. Previous schemes had been elegant, almost bloodless affairs targeting institutions rather than individuals. These attacks, while carefully controlled, directly endangered working-class laborers, people with no role in the systems of power Vale typically critiqued. This represented either a disturbing moral regression or a more sophisticated experimental design that Crowe had yet to fully comprehend. Clara provided the next piece of the puzzle during their meeting at a dockside cafe, where Crowe's antisocial tendencies were slightly mitigated by the anonymity of the crowd. She'd been investigating the ownership structures of Blackhaven's industrial facilities and had discovered a curious pattern. Over the past 18 months, a shell corporation called Prometheus Holdings had acquired minority stakes in 17 factories throughout the district. The acquisitions were small enough to avoid triggering regulatory scrutiny, never exceeding 15% ownership, but they granted access to board meetings, financial records, and operational details. Prometheus Holdings traced back to a web of offshore entities, but Clara's persistence had identified a common director across several subsidiaries. Marcus Thorne, a businessman known for philanthropic ventures in worker safety initiatives. On the surface, Thorne appeared to be exactly the type of reformer who might invest in factories to push for better conditions. But Crowe recognized the name from an entirely different context. Thorne had been a guest lecturer at Cambridge during Vale's tenure there, teaching a seminar on industrial psychology and organizational behavior. The connection was circumstantial but suggestive. Vale rarely committed crimes directly, preferring to operate through proxies, cultivated pawns, or unwitting accomplices. If Thorne was involved, he might not even realize he was serving Vale's agenda. The elegance of it impressed Crowe despite himself. Vale had positioned himself to access detailed operational information about dozens of factories while maintaining complete deniability. But why target these specific facilities? Crowe spent days analyzing every available data point about Thornbridge and Meridian, searching for commonalities beyond their inclusion in Prometheus Holdings' portfolio. The answer emerged gradually, like a photograph developing in chemicals. Both factories employed experimental safety monitoring systems installed 6 months earlier as part of a pilot program sponsored by, he confirmed with a bitter laugh, Marcus Thorne's Industrial Reform Initiative. The systems were cutting-edge, utilizing networked sensors and predictive maintenance algorithms. They were also, Crowe realized with growing certainty, the true target of Vale's sabotage. Vale wasn't testing the factory's vulnerability. He was testing the safety systems themselves, probing for flaws in the very technology designed to prevent accidents. Each incident provided data on response times, failure modes, and the cascading effects of seemingly minor mechanical compromises. Vale was conducting controlled experiments on industrial safety infrastructure, and every worker injury was simply a data point in his grotesque research. The realization nauseated Crowe, not because of its brutality. He'd encountered worse in his career, but because of its implication. If Vale was systematically testing safety systems, it meant he was planning something larger, some spectacular demonstration that would leverage the vulnerabilities he was currently mapping. The factory incidents weren't the crime, they were the research phase. The third incident occurred with Vale's characteristic sense of timing, arriving just as Crowe had begun to formulate his theory, but before he could act on it. The Ashford Chemical Works, a sprawling facility on the eastern edge of the industrial district, experienced a catastrophic ventilation failure during the night shift. Toxic fumes from a chlorine processing operation flooded the manufacturing floor, sending 14 workers to hospital with respiratory injuries. 3 remained in critical condition, their lungs seared by chemical exposure. Crowe arrived at the hospital before the investigators, before the press, before even some of the workers' families. He moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, his credentials and intensity granting him access to spaces typically restricted. Clara followed, her journalist's notebook forgotten as she witnessed the human cost of Vale's experiment written in the labored breathing of injured workers. One victim, a floor supervisor named Robert Chen, had maintained consciousness long enough to provide a statement to the first responders. Crowe obtained access to the recording through a contact in the fire marshal's office. Chen described the moments before the failure: a strange smell, different from the usual chemical odors of the facility, followed by alarms that triggered too late to prevent exposure. He'd attempted to activate the emergency ventilation system, but the controls had been unresponsive. The backup systems, which should have engaged automatically, had failed in sequence. The forensic pattern was becoming clearer. Vale wasn't simply sabotaging equipment. He was orchestrating cascading failures across multiple redundant safety systems. Each incident demonstrated a deeper understanding of how modern industrial facilities protected workers, and each revealed precisely how those protections could be circumvented. The Ashford attack was the most sophisticated yet, requiring detailed knowledge of chemical engineering, ventilation systems, and the facility's emergency protocols. Crowe examined the ventilation control systems personally, much to the annoyance of the official investigators. He discovered what he'd expected: subtle tampering with the programmable logic controllers that managed airflow, temperature, and gas detection. The modifications were elegant, almost admirable in their complexity. They'd been designed to trigger only under specific operational conditions: when the chlorine processing reached a certain stage of its cycle, when staffing levels indicated a full shift was present, when the external weather conditions would prevent natural dispersal of fumes. The timing mechanism was Vale's signature. Each previous incident had occurred at intervals of exactly 3 weeks, 21 days, a number that held no significance in industrial maintenance cycles but suggested a deliberate experimental cadence. Vale was allowing sufficient time between attacks for investigations to begin, for safety responses to be implemented, for a false sense of security to emerge, before striking again to test those very responses. Clara found Crowe in the Ashford facility's server room at 3 in the morning, surrounded by printouts of system logs and network traffic analyses. She'd learned not to interrupt him during these moments of deep concentration, but his appearance concerned her. He hadn't eaten in 18 hours, hadn't slept in longer than that, and his hands trembled slightly as they traced patterns across the datasheets. He looked up as she approached, his eyes bright with exhaustion and something close to excitement. He'd found it, the external connection point where Vale's modifications had been introduced. The control systems were networked, connected to a central monitoring platform managed by, predictably, Thorne's Industrial Reform Initiative. Someone with access to that central hub could potentially reach into any of the 17 factories in Prometheus Holdings' portfolio, adjusting parameters, disabling safeguards, and orchestrating failures from a comfortable distance. But more importantly, Crowe had identified the pattern within the pattern. The 3 factories targeted so far were not random selections from the portfolio. They represented a progression of complexity in their safety systems. Thornbridge used mechanical safeguards, Meridian used electromechanical systems, and Ashford employed fully digital networked controls. Vale was ascending a technological ladder, each attack testing increasingly sophisticated infrastructure, which meant the next target would employ the most advanced safety systems in Blackhaven's industrial district. Only one facility met that criterion: the Apex Manufacturing Complex, a state-of-the-art facility that produced precision components for aerospace applications. Apex had recently completed a comprehensive safety modernization, installing an integrated system that utilized artificial intelligence to predict and prevent accidents before they occurred. It was the flagship installation for Thorne's safety initiative, frequently showcased in trade publications and regulatory presentations. Crowe understood with sudden clarity that Apex wasn't just the next target, it was the true objective. Everything else had been preparation, gathering data to ensure the final demonstration would be absolutely devastating. Vale intended to prove that even the most advanced safety systems could be subverted, that human ingenuity could always outsmart human protection. The earlier incidents, the injured workers, the suffering families, all were merely the price of research for Vale's ultimate experiment. 3 weeks from the Ashford incident would be the 23rd of November. Crowe had exactly 18 days to prevent Vale's masterpiece of destruction. Time became Crowe's adversary as much as Vale himself. 18 days to understand Vale's complete methodology, to identify his access point, to prevent an attack on a facility employing nearly 400 workers. The challenge energized him in ways that months of boredom had not, but it also revealed the fundamental tension in his nature. His intellectual fascination with Vale's scheme competed with his recognition of its human cost. Clara became his anchor to that human dimension. While Crowe mapped network architectures and analyzed system vulnerabilities, she interviewed workers at Apex, documented their stories, their families, their lives. She forced him to review photographs of the injured from previous attacks, to read letters from their children, to confront the reality that his abstract puzzle had faces and names. He found it unbearably tedious and absolutely necessary. Marcus Thorne proved unexpectedly cooperative when Crowe finally approached him directly. The businessman's involvement appeared genuine. He seemed horrified by the suggestion that his safety initiative had been weaponized. He provided complete access to the central monitoring system, administrative records, and security logs. But this transparency itself troubled Crowe. Vale rarely left such obvious trails unless he wanted them to be found. The central monitoring hub was housed in an unassuming office building in Blackhaven's financial district. Crowe spent 4 days effectively living in their server room, surviving on coffee and Clara's persistent delivery of sandwiches he rarely remembered to eat. He traced every access point, every modification, every suspicious login. The forensic trail eventually led to a contract technician who'd performed routine maintenance 3 months earlier. The technician, when located, had no memory of making the specific changes, but acknowledged that such modifications could have been introduced under the guise of system optimization. Vale's methodology crystallized in Crowe's understanding. He'd infiltrated the safety network not through dramatic hacking, but through patient social engineering and strategic patience. A bribed or deceived technician here, a forged authorization there, tiny modifications introduced over months that collectively created a backdoor into the entire system. It was elegant, nearly undetectable, and utterly characteristic of Vale's approach. But understanding Vale's access didn't reveal his specific plan for Apex. The facility's AI-driven safety system was exponentially more complex than anything at the previous targets. It monitored thousands of variables simultaneously, using machine learning algorithms to identify risk patterns and automatically implement preventive measures. Disabling it would require either compromising the AI itself or creating a scenario so novel that the system couldn't recognize the danger until too late. Crowe visited Apex personally, walking its floors under the pretense of a safety audit. The facility was impressive, almost beautiful in its systematic organization. Robotic assembly lines moved with balletic precision, monitored by sensors that detected microscopic deviations. The workers moved with confidence, protected by technology they trusted absolutely. That trust, Crowe realized, was Vale's real target. He wasn't just trying to cause an accident. He wanted to shatter faith in the very concept of technological safety. The breakthrough came 6 days before the projected attack date. Crowe, in a moment of exhausted lateral thinking, reconsidered his basic assumptions. He'd been treating the AI safety system as Vale's target for subversion, but what if it was his weapon? The system operated by identifying patterns associated with danger, but patterns could be spoofed. If one introduced false data suggesting danger in one area, the system would redirect resources and attention there, creating vulnerabilities elsewhere. He tested the hypothesis through simulation, modeling the facility's operations and the AI's likely responses. The results were disturbing. By creating a series of minor anomalies in the facility's northern manufacturing wing, small temperature fluctuations, vibration patterns, chemical readings, one could cause the AI to concentrate monitoring and preventive resources there. This would create a temporary blind spot in the southern wing, where the actual sabotage could be executed below the system's detection threshold. The southern wing housed Apex's heat treatment facility, where aerospace components were subjected to extreme temperatures in controlled furnaces. A failure there, particularly in the quenching system that cooled superheated metal, could trigger an explosion that would make the previous incidents seem trivial. Hundreds of workers could be injured or killed, and the facility itself might be destroyed. Crowe presented his findings to Clara in his study on the evening of November 20th, 3 days before Vale's expected attack. She listened silently as he outlined the probable methodology, the timing, the likely casualties. When he finished, she asked the question he'd been avoiding. What did he intend to do with this knowledge? He could alert authorities, evacuate the facility, prevent the attack entirely. But that would let Vale escape again, free to continue his experiments elsewhere, having learned from this failure. Alternatively, he could allow events to proceed to the brink, positioning himself to intervene at the critical moment, catching Vale in the act and ensuring his permanent removal from society. This approach risked lives, but offered the possibility of ending the threat permanently. Clara's response was uncharacteristically sharp. She reminded him that he wasn't a god choosing which lives to risk in service of some greater strategic victory. She challenged his assumption that his superior intellect granted him authority to make such calculations. She forced him to confront the arrogance underlying his hesitation, the belief that only he could stop Vale, that only his perfect solution would suffice. The argument lasted hours, ranging across ethical philosophy, utilitarian calculus, and personal responsibility. It was the most emotionally intense conversation Crowe had experienced in years, and he discovered he lacked the vocabulary to adequately defend his position. Not because his logic was flawed, but because Clara was arguing from premises he'd never fully internalized. The intrinsic value of human life, the limits of consequentialist thinking, the moral weight of choosing inaction. By dawn, Crowe had made his decision. He would prevent the attack directly, accepting that Vale would likely escape again. But he would do so in a way that gathered sufficient evidence to permanently dismantle Vale's network, even if it couldn't immediately imprison Vale himself. It was, Clara observed with tired satisfaction, the first time she'd seen him prioritize human welfare over intellectual victory. The morning of November 23rd arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself conspired against the tension that had built over preceding weeks. Crowe had not slept in 40 hours, but his mind maintained the crystal clarity that extreme exhaustion sometimes paradoxically produced. He'd positioned himself at the Apex facility before dawn, ostensibly as a safety consultant conducting a final pre-audit review. Clara remained at the central monitoring hub with Marcus Thorne, ready to document whatever transpired. The facility operated normally through the morning shift. Workers arrived, systems initialized, production commenced with mechanical regularity. Crowe monitored multiple information streams simultaneously: security camera feeds, system logs, network traffic, even the facility's ambient sound profile. He'd positioned subtle sensors of his own design at critical points, devices that would detect the minute electromagnetic signatures associated with unauthorized system access. The first anomaly appeared at 10:47 a.m. Temperature sensors in the northern manufacturing wing began registering fluctuations. Nothing dramatic, but sufficient to trigger the AI's attention algorithms. Crowe watched as the safety system responded exactly as he'd predicted, reallocating monitoring resources to investigate the potential issue. The pattern was beginning. Over the next hour, additional anomalies appeared in the northern wing: minor vibration irregularities, subtle pressure variations in pneumatic systems, microscopic chemical composition deviations. Each was below the threshold for automated response, but collectively formed a pattern of concern. The AI's attention focused increasingly on that sector, exactly as Vale had intended. Crowe moved through the facility toward the southern heat treatment wing, his presence unremarkable among the dozens of workers and supervisors. He'd identified the probable sabotage point: the quenching system's computerized controls, which regulated the precisely timed immersion of superheated components in cooling fluid. The system was highly automated, requiring minimal human oversight, which made it ideal for remote manipulation. At 12:03 p.m., Crowe's sensors detected it, a brief burst of encrypted data transmitted to the quenching system's controller. The signal originated from outside the facility's network, routing through the central monitoring hub via the backdoor Vale had carefully constructed. The modification was elegant, a subtle adjustment to the timing algorithm that would cause the quenching cycle to delay by exactly 12 seconds when the next batch of components reached critical temperature. That 12-second delay would allow metal temperatures to exceed the cooling system's design parameters, causing rapid fluid vaporization and explosive pressure buildup. Crowe had perhaps 90 seconds before the modified algorithm executed. He could attempt to countermand it remotely, but Vale had certainly anticipated that response and would have implemented safeguards. The only certain solution was direct intervention at the physical level. He reached the heat treatment control station where a technician monitored the furnace cycle. Without explanation or permission, Crowe pushed past the startled worker and accessed the emergency shutdown panel. The technician protested, grabbing his arm, demanding to know who he was and what he was doing. Other workers noticed the commotion, several moving to intervene. Crowe had no time for explanation, no capacity for the social niceties that might have diffused the situation. He simply stated in a voice that carried absolute certainty that the quenching system had been sabotaged and would explode within 60 seconds unless he initiated emergency shutdown immediately. Something in his tone, or perhaps the manic intensity of his appearance, gave the technician pause. The furnace cycle showed 45 seconds remaining before the critical component batch reached quenching stage. Crowe's fingers moved across the control panel with desperate precision, navigating through safety interlocks designed to prevent accidental shutdown. Each interlock required confirmation, precious seconds consumed by bureaucratic safeguards intended to prevent exactly this type of hasty intervention. 20 seconds. The components reached critical temperature, the automated system initiating transfer to the quenching station. Crowe bypassed the final safety interlock, something that would certainly cost him legal consequences later, and triggered full emergency shutdown. The furnace systems immediately ceased operation, the component batch halting mid-transfer, suspended in a state of superheated limbo. Alarms erupted throughout the facility as the emergency shutdown cascaded across interconnected systems. The southern wing evacuated in trained precision, 400 workers moving to designated safety zones. The quenching system's pressure built exactly as Crowe had predicted, relief valves screaming as they vented superheated vapor, but the explosive failure never materialized. The components, arrested mid-cycle, would be ruined, a significant financial loss, but no one would be injured. In the chaos of evacuation and emergency response, Crowe felt the peculiar emptiness that always followed his victories. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only the absence of disaster and the certainty that Vale had once again slipped away. The evidence of tampering would be documented, the backdoor access exposed, but Vale himself would be untraceable, protected by layers of technical obfuscation and legal insulation. Clara found him an hour later, sitting in the facility's cafeteria while investigators swarmed through the building. She'd witnessed the signal interception from the monitoring hub, had documented the entire attack sequence, and had already drafted an article that would expose the systematic exploitation of industrial safety systems. Marcus Thorne, devastated by the revelation that his reform initiative had been weaponized, was cooperating fully with authorities. She sat across from Crowe, saying nothing, understanding that he needed no congratulation or comfort. After several minutes of silence, she simply observed that 374 workers had returned to their families that evening, unharmed. That 14 people hospitalized in previous attacks would eventually recover. That while Vale remained free, his methodology had been exposed and could no longer be replicated without detection. Crowe acknowledged this with a slight nod, his exhaustion finally overwhelming his nervous energy. He wondered, as he always did after encounters with Vale, whether his adversary had anticipated even this outcome, whether the entire scheme had been designed not to succeed but to teach some obscure lesson about human vulnerability or institutional failure. Vale's experiments never quite concluded. They simply transitioned to new phases, accumulating data across years of carefully orchestrated provocations. But for now, the factory was silent in the way it should be, empty of workers at shift's end, quiet with a peaceful absence of emergency, still with the temporary safety that Crowe had managed to preserve. He allowed himself a moment to appreciate that silence before his mind inevitably turned toward whatever experiment Vale was already designing in some distant corner of the world, whatever new pattern waited to be discovered and unraveled. Clara touched his hand briefly before standing to leave, a gesture of connection that he neither fully understood nor entirely rejected. In that moment, Elias Crowe felt something approximate to what others might call satisfaction, not at his own cleverness, but at the simple mathematical fact that tonight, The variables had aligned in favor of life over death, safety over chaos, even if only temporarily and incompletely. The game would continue. Vale would resurface. But for now, in this particular equation, humanity had reached a solution that favored its own survival. And that, Crowe supposed, would have to be enough.